All right, welcome back to episode 3 of Year One Podcast. If you're new, welcome. And if you're coming back, we thank you for the support and welcome you back to another episode where we dive in to the topic of trust in institutions today. I know there's a lot of talk at the end of the episode last time of trust in institutions, and I know that's a big topic to handle. But I think we can just start with what are some of the largest institutions today that I guess most of society or us in general do not trust or is losing trust.
Well, when we talk about trust in institutions, we have to be trustworthy ourselves. This is the 4th episode of the Year One podcast.
The fourth episode.
But we in the last episode we ended talking about this topic, and it's one that I've given a lot of thought to. But I wanted to have some data to back it up. And Micah this week in our group chat sent the Gallup poll. So I'm going to share that snippet with you guys. Can you see my screen? And it just shows the huge lack of trust that especially Gen Z has in the leading institutions in the country. And Gavin, you posed a question. Okay, what are those institutions? We have on here different government organizations: Congress, the executive branch, the judicial system, but then you have things like the military and the police. Nothing was particularly shocking to me in this graph in terms of the huge lack of trust. I was actually pretty surprised to see such a high level of trust in science, especially post-COVID. I am curious to hear what you guys think in terms of if anything sticks out to you or what trends you're seeing here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can go ahead and sort of get in here. I think a lot of, sort of what you see, as it relates to sort of media, newspaper, and then sort of the information that you find on like information you find on the internet. I find that one really like telling to me, because we have 58% with people categorizing as some. I think that's really interesting because it's very hard, I find, at least personally, to sort of find truth in things that I'm looking at, particularly on Twitter, and filter out the things that I don't actually find to be legit versus things, that I find to not be true. So, just off of first glance, that's what I think is the most telling one, on this chart.
Yeah, when I was looking into just this kind of research, I was more focused on the news. And I mean, look how small that bar is for the news in terms of a great deal. And in looking at that, I was interested to see like what the top news stations slogans were. And for example, for CNN, it's the most trusted name in news. And then you look at the bar chart, and that just does not reflect that. And then for Fox News, it's fair and balanced. I mean, balanced. I don't know about that. But what I'm trying to say is like these news stations are saying one thing, and their slogan is supposed to be the thing that is their guiding light and what they value. And they're just not doing that. And it's completely evident through what people think right now and the lack of trust. And I think it really comes down to saying what your values are, and if you stick with them, then you'll be trusted. But if you're not going to, then it's very difficult to say, yeah, like I will trust them and be able to accept whatever information they're giving.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think right here, it's like I'm looking at this now, like from a business perspective. Like you see, like okay, obviously, like I don't know if you ever, as like an entrepreneur, can fix the presidency or Congress, right? But like I don't know, it's interesting. News is something that like pops out right into my mind of like something that's completely lost credibility, and I think of like I don't know if you guys ever like go on like one of these email news outlet like outlooks like well there's like Substack, right? That's like a first principle like news source that's kind of like popping up different people's opinion that you trust, and then you listen to their analysis for news. But then there's also things like Morning Brew and whatnot, and like I don't know, I think this is interesting. Like you have all these different outlets that are kind of like leveraging the fallout of institutional trust. So I'd love to hear your guys' kind of perspective on that.
Yeah, I think that there's two things there. We dipped in. It makes sense if there's a lessening trust of institutions, something has to rise to fill that void, right? And the question becomes whether the thing that fills that void is of quality or not. If it's in fact in the end less trustworthy than the original institution that it's there to replace. And we briefly touched about last week the topic of modern frauds, and a lot of them are born out of the void that's created by lack of trust in institutions. To take two prime examples, the financial institutions, which have taken a major hit, especially since the 2008 financial crisis, and the news media. And look at what's risen in the wake of the financial institutions. Some great things, blockchain as a concept and select cryptocurrencies, but also a whole lot of frauds, right? That we all know and that we can that come top of mind. Sam Bankman-Fried, like we discussed, Dogecoin, the whole NFT craze, like that's insane, you know? And then on the information side, there's, of course, these alternative independent news sources, like you mentioned, Felipe, the guys that are on Substack, the people doing long form YouTube videos, long form podcasts. But then there's also just the people that are spewing like things that they know aren't correct, or that they're intentionally coming at it from a point where they're trying to move the needle in one direction or the other with the information that they're sharing.
Yeah, no, completely. It's funny with your first example with like sort of financial institutions, when you have so much just made up quantitative easing and interest rates at zero, you can come up with all these things such as Dogecoin, FTX, et cetera, just all these sort of frauds, right? And the same thing with your second example and sort of just news, all these people on self healing and self meditation books, all they're really selling, you're the product, right? They're just selling to you and making money off of you, and it's so easy to do that in today's society. So the best thing I think for us is how do we like avoid that and do something about it.
Personally, I think that it comes down to setting your values and knowing what to accept and what not to. Like at the macro level, you can look at banks and you can look at the news and you can see them saying one thing but doing another. And in terms of the micro level, it comes down to what decisions are you going to make? And if that's in business, if that's at your job, if that's wherever you are, then the best thing you can do is set values and stay true to them. I mean, that's how I see it. But in terms of influencing like the macro level trends, I mean, I'm sure we all hope to do that one day, but right now, as I sit here today, I think that is the best form of contributing to a positive outcome in terms of institutions and trust being able to move forward.
Yeah, it's tough because these institutions too are sticky, right? Like
Right.
Fox News, CNN, like you could call it like some type of duopoly, or like, you know, you have like a left wing and a right wing cable news, and you look at it and you're like, okay, this is archaic, like this thing's going away, like all the viewership is old people, like there's no way this thing lasts. But like, name me like an alternative where people are like watching their news and like these companies are worth billions and billions of dollars. Like, I guess you have like marketplaces like Twitter, right? Or whatever, which is like the underlying platform. But like Fox News and CNN are probably the most profitable like news outlets. And like probably for another 10, maybe 20 years, like they're gonna be making, they're worth over $1 billion. And like I look at Morning Brew and I think their valuation, I can't remember what it was specifically, but like, I mean, I think they raised like a few tens of millions of dollars and whatnot. And like, all right, like it's a real company, but like it's not Fox News or CNN level. So
75
these
million.
legacy, yeah, these legacy companies. Yeah, no, you raise a great point. I think one thing that I really enjoy about Twitter is that a lot of the information is localized, and it's only the people on Twitter that really feed into this. There's this guy, his name is Noah Batum. He was one of, I think, like the first 15 people at Waze, like the traffic sort of thing. And he branched off, and he's been following him for about like 6 months after I found out about the company. But he founded this company called Post. And essentially what Post tries to do is it tries to localize news, right? So it's not your CNN, your Don Lennon, your Sean Hannity's, et cetera. I'm expressing the news. It's actually people in the space in that localized community. And I really found it interesting because what he's trying to do is create where I think Elon Musk is trying to do and grow Twitter into sort of this space where people can have extreme opinions about things, but like let's actually have a dialogue about it. He's trying to do that on this app while also localizing news. And I think that's sort of where we're going because of this lack of trust that we have from the chart that you shared at first, Zach, that I think there's a growing emergence with people in our generation that have this growing concern of the institutions that control it. And I think the sharp money is starting to see that and then adjust. And start to create companies that do that.
100%. And when you pose the question, okay, what do we do about it? Which I think is the fundamental question in any of these meta conversations. Right. In my perspective, there's two approaches, right? One is as the consumer of the products of these institutions, and the other is a producer of alternatives, right? And in the consumer, Gavin, as you said, I highlight what you were talking about in terms of it's holding value strongly, right? And it's following your gut and determining what it is that aligns with what resonates as truthful to you and following that, whether that's NFTs or whether that's local creators on Twitter. And you're not gonna get it right all the time, but at least then you won't think that you've been taken for a fool when either time shows that you are on the right or the wrong side of things. And as a producer, I had a really interesting conversation back to the founder of the train ride program that I was on. Is this guy who came from a small village in India, built himself up, and is now running for the equivalent of Congress in India, right? And he talked a lot about institutions because the institutions that they have in India were built by the colonial powers, and they're really struggling now with, okay, we have these colonial institutions, what do we do with them? And I posed a question to him, what do you do? Do you just tear everything down and start again? Or do you work on the inside to try to save what you have? And he put a cup in front of him and he said, if this is the institution, we go around it by creating something, a better alternative, and that weakens the institution over time because the roots that used to support the historical institutions are now fading. The people, the resources, the energy that used to flow into the traditional institutions are now fading, and we see that. Look at media, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a big generational difference. I think that, frankly, our parents' generation has a lot more embedded trust in institutions in general, and especially the media, right? But we're seeing that script flipped, and we're seeing the rise of these local creators. So on the producer side, it's the same thing as on the consumer side. It's having strong values and taking bets on the trends that you think are the future. Decentralization, I think, is a big trend that will continue to thrive in the future.
To that point, Zach, I think like a great example is Uber and like taxi, right? Like that's just like the Silicon Valley way of doing it. It's like, okay, you have this alternative, like we're just gonna pump it up with money, and like, you know, like taxi still survives. Like whenever I go to the airport, I sometimes take a taxi to wherever I need to go, but like this alternative has created just like a better system, you know, like beforehand you had to call the taxi company, like they could take 30 minutes, they could take an hour, like, and like there was no alternative. Now like, yeah, I mean you just call an Uber. And so that's definitely like, I think the way that it's been done in like innovation and whatnot. And I mean, yeah, if you're going to be a betting man, just going into that sector, there's low institutional trust. You think you can do a better idea and like see what happens. Yeah.
And Uber's a great example, right? Because look at how many barriers there were for Uber to thrive. They had so many cities said, you're not allowed here. The taxi unions were slashing their tires on the street. But if you can create a better alternative, you will win in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think another example is like Airbnb, for instance, right? It used to be this, small, not Airbnb, but it used to be people would go on eBay to rent a space for a couple of days or something like that. And then that market has grown into Airbnb, being one example. I really like the point that you hit on about sort of these generational differences. I think a lot with sort of our parents and sort of that a Gen X generation, the baby boomer, they obviously had massive trust in these institutions because the feedback loop was real, right? Like there was forgot the example my mentor was telling me one time, but they used to like CNN and Fox, they used to have these actual debate shows where they would have both people being speakers from both sides of the political spectrum. And they would have these open debates. But now all you see is they'll have they'll have people come on, but it's mostly people just upholding already that ideology of whatever entity they're speaking for. And that has a lot to do with sort of what we see. And then you see sort of an outsourcing of it in media or newspapers, the things that we read every day. So I really like that point. I think there's something there.
Yeah, I love the point of just like from a consumer perspective, putting your dollars toward the things that you want to align with. And I like to look at it from a business perspective, from like what are the companies trying to do? Are they like a mission-driven company? And most are, like most have a value prop or a mission of some kind. And you look at the ones that are best at doing that. And like back to the slogan thing where they just have one mission and they try to achieve it. Like look at Patagonia, for example. Their mission is to save our home planet. And that is their mission, and they align with it. Like they donated like all their money. And consumers see that. Like consumers see that they were transparent. They made it, he made it a nonprofit, right? And then like gave up all of the equity. And then, I mean, they're only getting smarter as well. Consumers and Gen Z, I think that ties into the news aspect of it too, is the things that we're consuming, whether it's information or products, we care more and more about what that is, whether it's going into our bodies, whether it's in our house, or if it's on our phone. I think that is the big change. in terms of the different generations.
And Gavin, to your point, I mean, I think like so one company that like kind of comes to mind is Daily Wire. I don't know if you guys have seen like what they do, but like with chocolate, they were like mad about some M&M commercial, and they're like, okay, we've come out with our own chocolate like company, and they came out with it in like, I think it was like a week or something. And then with like razor blades, they did the same thing. And like, if you look at the commercial that the guy had, he was just basically like, they don't align with your values. If you're like conservative, we do, and we're happy to take your money. And like, we don't think that their product's that much better, so like, we're gonna do it. And that's like a very interesting like intersection, right? Because you have like, on the one hand, we think of like Uber, right? And there's this like institution that technologically like ripe for like innovation. But then you also have like brands like M&M, right? Mr. Beast made his own chocolate company, and I think they're grossing like over $100 million. He said in that interview, and the All In Summit or whatever. And it's like, people don't feel aligned with a certain brand. Mom and dad might have grown up with like Mars, you know, Snickers, whatever. Kid that's 15, not really. And so it's open for whatever. And this is like more of a brand type of thing. But yeah, I think it's interesting. It's not only just on those technological micro sectors, but it's also, you know, in kind of brand.
Yeah, that's a great point, because like, if brands are looking for a differentiation point, like I was reading this thing on the Tom's Shoes founder, and he was like, we're not going to be able to compete in the shoe market. This is one of the most competitive markets. Like, everybody has their costs down. It's so hard to compete. But then he decided to do the buy one, give one model. And then all of a sudden he's different. And there's so many people that aligned with that vision. And same thing for Mr. Beast. Like, Mr. Beast, whether it's, you know, giving back to the community or keeping people entertained, people would much rather give dollars to that than Mars or Snickers or whatever company that we're used to.
And that's so exciting to me. To echo what you're saying, Gavin, and that the consumer isn't dumb, right? In fact, they're very smart, and they can parse out who is telling them the truth and who is not telling them the truth. Over time, they can parse that out. And I think that fact alone means that these institutions, from Congress and the presidency all the way down to candy bars, are going to be forced to improve themselves. It's not going to be a simple PR campaign, right? Because that's not going to be substantial truth that will last. People will reject that in the long run. They are going to be forced to make serious improvements to meet the customer demands, or else they're going to die.
Yeah. So going sort of back to that, to the question, do you restore institutional trust by breaking down the system, or do you restore it by making an iteration and forcing or coming back and understanding what the consumer is saying? How would you go about it? For all of you, honestly.
Alternative. I mean, I think in some way it depends on the level that you're talking about. It would be very hard to create an alternative police force or an alternative military or presidency. But an alternative candy bar, an alternative beer. I mean, look at the whole Bud Light controversy that happened recently. These are things that can be chipped away at and can quickly become the new institutions.
Well, remember also, right, like what the issue is with some of these institutions, right? It's like they get too big, and then there's just so much like institutional in like pressure from the inside to not change, right? That like it kind of becomes impossible, right? So like some of these big companies, right? If you're like moving a little bit one way ideologically or one way or the other, and like a large percentage of the people in the inside are like kind of moving in that direction too, you try to change direction, you get like strikes, you get walkouts, you get
Right.
all of this pressure, right? So like that's why you can come in from the outside and kind of like move around people. But yeah, I mean, when we're talking about Congress or the police force, like I don't know how that's done. That's like really difficult. And like, yeah, it's super true. Like it's like
I
this
mean,
Leviathan
we want it.
situation, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it. We want it. The stats quantitatively sort of back it up. But to both of your points, the extreme sense of that, what does that look like? This isn't, the French Revolution, right? We're not just gonna, beat down the Constitution and make a new one. But then how do the question that looms, and I think the sort of macro question is how do you fix it? Do you, you know, I
I
don't know,
would
I guess
argue
it's
that
tough.
I would argue that we are by means of having this conversation and publishing it.
Yeah,
We're
I agree. I agree.
alternative to media, and I think that's. I mean, we're hitting on I think something that's kind of the plight of the young entrepreneur, the young creator is, oh my gosh, there's so many amazing, huge things that I want to do in this world. Where do I start? I mean, if you were to make a pitch deck for creating an alternative to the military, you probably get laughed out of every room, rightfully so,
Yeah.
But if you want to make a new a new candy bar because, hey, look, there's a lot of ire towards M&Ms, towards whatever brand that isn't aligned with the true spirit of young people or of the country in general, there's room there.
I agree. And with the initial question, Micah, I think that there's kind of a breaking point, and it really depends on the consumer demands. Like if the consumer demand isn't there, then there's probably no reason to innovate. But it's really what is that breaking point on the different levels. Like we look at the police force, like what would a breaking point be on that level for that to just like topple and we need another solution? And in some cases, I feel like that is what's necessary in order for foundational change to happen, is that something so unfortunately so bad has to happen for change to take place. And for like a consumer product, that that cost of switching isn't as high. So something that aligns with your values more, you're more likely to choose. But in terms of police force, that cost of switching is very high, and it would take a lot to move the needle and to change it.
Yeah, no, I think internally we feel this a lot, right? I think right now exactly what you're saying is this huge divide between sort of culture and values. This isn't original. This is mostly from Ray Dalio, but that's what is this growing feeling that I feel like we feel in the United States. That's why it's like the minute you talk to someone that you might be pro-life, that person, or you're for guns, you're immediately sort of put into this group of you're a Trump, MAGA, racist supporter. And then on the contrary, it's like if you were some a liberal stance, you're some Bernie Sanders sort of unicorn, where really that's not really the essence of either, but that's sort of these groupings that we put. And I think what's really aiding that is sort of this lack in our institutions and this growing frustration that we feel. And then I feel like that's sort of an offshoot not only in government or in Congress, but also in media, and then sort of in just regular discourse that we have. And I feel like a lot of people feel this, especially with our generation. And it's something that we need to somehow adhere to. So
Yeah, I mean it's bad, or it kind of like, excuse me for my French, feels like shit if you find yourself like in a weird position where you're like, if you're like, I'm liberal but I like guns, or I don't know, whatever it could be, right? But that's also like an opportunity to create something, right? Like
I agree.
there's always like that makes you the first person to be the pioneer that starts an organization that, like, I don't know, like is like in this case like liberal gun lovers, or I don't know, like right, like you could be like the head of that, or like, or you could be the one to start a chocolate company that aligns with your values or whatever it is, right? So yeah, well, at the same time it sucks, and like I don't think it will never institutions will never like fail to keep up with the values of people, right? Like that's also an opportunity for young people to get in there and shake things up. So yeah.
And I think that so much of the separation that you mentioned, especially on the political side, which has been the biggest example of divisiveness lately, is illusion, both in fact and in practice, because candidly, the vast majority, I can't recall a conversation. I like having political discussions with people. I can't recall a conversation where it's just been shut down because we're so far divided. I think that people want to find a common ground in most cases, most good-natured people. Maybe it's not the people that you're seeing on the TV or on Twitter or on these that have the big voices, but the people that you pass by on the street and that you stop and have a conversation with, you're going to have more agreement than disagreement with them. But I think that the question that comes out of that is, okay, how then does that get incentivized, right? Because let's take running for office, for example. You're in some ways incentivized to have an opinion that speaks to one of the two sides, right? I mean, you're not going to be seen as an exciting or dynamic politician if you come out and you say, hey, let's, have some gun reform, but we're not going to ban all guns. Maybe AR-15s gotta go, but overall, we're not going to change the status quo too much. That's not going to move the needle as much as ban all guns, that's a lot more. So I think a good question is, how do we make the incentives so that the voices of reason can shine?
Yeah, again, I think you just said that perfectly. And I think Felipe, you and I did that sort of when we were in Miami. Tim Urban, this like famous blogger, he spoke at the All In Summit 2 years ago, but he sort of puts it sort of on this X and Y axis, right? With the X axis being sort of that political spectrum that we talked about, but on the Y axis, sort of it being that high rung versus low rung. And sort of the difference between those is on the high rung side are people that you can have political disagreements with, whether you like agree on things or you disagree with them. But on the low rung is sort of the people that you see on Twitter, right? The people that have their strong opinions, only find stats that uphold their opinion without having the nuance to listen to the other person's opinion. And they just fight, they combat. And we have to persist. And I think what we're doing with this podcast is growing that discourse of not high rung in the sense where high is better than low, but in the sense where it's two people with two different opinions and they're talking about it. Where they disagree, and it's trying to find sort of that commonality between the two. I definitely want to put that one in the show notes of this episode because I've listened to it maybe 100 times. It's one of my favorite 20-minute bites of him explaining that.
That is just super interesting on both. But Zach, when you said the point of like virality and being very one-sided, like nobody's like that. Like nobody is just put into a silo and that's how you define them. So it's very, I don't know, it's interesting because on Twitter, Instagram, or really anything on any media platform, whoever shouts the loudest and has the most like out there thing to say usually gets the most views or attention or what have you. And how do you monetize and how do you direct attention to someone that might not be saying something like outlandish and funny and crazy? Like that's just a difficult thing, but does it have to be? I don't know.
And it can't, what the answer can't be is manipulating let's take the Twitter example, manipulating the algorithms to let certain people shine through, because that's just a recipe for disaster, you know? And it goes back to the consumer isn't stupid, right? But even me, who I like to think that I have nuanced opinions, if you were to look at my Twitter feed, it's probably people that are saying the quick hits that align with my perspective, you know? And that's, if I'm spending 3 minutes scrolling, that's what, candidly, that's what I want to consume versus a long form, both sides debate. So I think it's probably starts with us as consumers and thinking, okay, how do I kind of raise the level for myself?
Yeah, and that's what I think is just the value driven approach, and being able to shut off Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, whatever it is for you, and being able to realize that these conversations that we're having right now is the real world, and that is not on social media.
Yeah, I think sort of piggybacking like off of that, I think if anyone, if you fit, this is an original, it's from the ball, but if you fit too neatly into a basket of ideology, or you follow what your friend or your neighbor believes, you're just in most cases just not a free thinker. And I think that's what we have a lot going on. It's just that it's trying to be a clear thinker versus not being a free thinker. And I think that's what a lot of people do, is that they just get their opinion from that person that they see on Twitter that upholds what they, you know, already had sort of a subconscious belief about. And the modern day struggle is sort of resisting that and sort of being a free thinker for yourself.
Mike, I think that you deserve a thank you from all of us, because you just gave us our topic for next week, and that's independent thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll see. I mean, some companies, right? Like we'll see if you can change an institution around. I mean, we're talking about Twitter. I mean, that is a company that had that method of what you were talking about, Zach, of like censoring certain types of speech and pushing or enabling others types of speech to kind of gain virality. And they've completely turned it around. And there is a lot of resistance, not only from like the employees themselves, which Elon just like fired, but it's also like from advertisers and whatnot, and they're very uncomfortable with this. And so we'll see. I mean, it might not be the perfect example because Elon is his own man, his own free thinker, own personality in a sense. But I mean, we'll see if Twitter is able to even grow more than it was and start competing with Meta in terms of size. I mean, you could start seeing kind of the signs of, or the blueprint of how you take an archaic institution and turn it around. So, yeah.
Yeah, with that, I think we do have our next topic, and we would like to thank all the listeners for tuning in to episode 4 of the podcast, and we will see you next week.
See ya.
See ya.
Bye.